It's important to know that these rankings we're going through today are rest of season rankings and not playoff rankings. And the rest of the season is exactly 2 more weeks to the fantasy playoffs. So these are exactly referring to the next 2 weeks of the fantasy football season. But before we go through, the 2 last winners of the 5 free FFN hats for hitting 18,000 subscribers are going to be G Medina and Tiger Bats. Congratulations to both of you for winning a free FFN hat. Just email me, Football Fanalysts Network at gmail.com, and send me your name and address for your free hat. And I'm still giving away 5 free FFN hats for when I hit 19,000 subscribers. And the way to qualify to get one is to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support, and give me your hottest take for week 13 fantasy football. Now, getting into our first tier of guys, I've got these 2 guys particularly isolated because schedule absolutely lines up for them, and they've both just been world beaters at the running back position. Saquon Barkley and Devon Achane. With Saquon Barkley, I think we can all agree it doesn't matter what schedule is. Like, Saquon Barkley's impact in fantasy football is so freaking insane on a weekly basis. The last several weeks, he's gone absolutely nuclear. He had over 300 yards from scrimmage against the Rams defense, which is actually pretty good defensively. So with Saquon Barkley, I don't really care. And I don't even think it's relevant to bring a matchup when he can rip off 70-yard runs left and right. It's always possible with him, and he still gets the receiving upside. They have found their identity in Philadelphia, and that is running the ball with Saquon Barkley. And with Devon Achane here, ever since Tua came back, his floor has basically been like 15 points, with the exception of one game where he kind of busted a little bit. But even that game, he had like 8 fantasy points and a half PPR format. So with Devon Achane here, his floor with Tua Tagovailoa is just too high to ignore and keep him outside of tier 1. And with Devon Achane, over the next 2 weeks in particular with him, I do think that there are definitely beatable matchups here for Devon Achane to take advantage of. We look at his next 2 games. He's got Green Bay and the New York Jets. We obviously know the Jets are going to be a fantastic matchup, and Green Bay is definitely beatable on the ground. Christian McCaffrey didn't do it, but that offense was definitely weak. Whereas Devon Achane and the Dolphins, they're kind of firing on all cylinders right now. Now, dropping down to our next tier right here, I've got Derrick Henry at number 3 and Josh Jacobs at number 4. So listen with Derrick Henry, obviously. Derrick Henry is obviously a fantastic player. I have said over the past several weeks, though, it is kind of a matchup thing with Derrick Henry, though. So with tonight, we obviously have not seen him play tonight. This video is coming out before the Monday night game versus the Los Angeles Chargers here. That's not the easiest matchup, and then he gets Philadelphia the following week, and then a bye week in week 14. So his matchups here are not particularly great. And again, I have said it for weeks now. He is a little bit matchup dependent because it kind of decides whether he's going to hit his floor, which is typically around 14 to 20 points, or if he's going to hit his ceiling, which is in excess of 25, 30 fantasy points. I think those are more floor games, which are obviously still great, but I think it is worthy of a tier 2 ranking this week. And then with Josh Jacobs at 4, Josh Jacobs has been awesome in fantasy football. That guy's on a heater right now. I mean, Josh Jacobs is the running back 7 in fantasy football because over the past month, he's had 1 game outside of 20 fantasy points in a half PPR format. And over the next 2 weeks, he gets Miami and Detroit. Now, obviously, Detroit's tough. There's no getting around that. But Miami's matchup is a fantastic one for running backs in fantasy football. And just the way Josh Jacobs is playing right now, I can't see him ranking outside of the top 5 at this point. Then we've got Jahmyr Gibbs and Joe Mixon at 5 and 6. Gibbs is obviously fantastic. This Detroit running system, again, schedule doesn't matter. Like, this team is so centered around the run, and they're the best run team by a mile in this entire league. Like, they're both of those guys, and of course you'll see Montgomery at some point today. Both of these guys are fantastic in fantasy, and Gibbs has become just like Montgomery, where it's like you can kind of count on a touchdown every single week. And he obviously is more explosive in the receiving game as well. He's definitely the higher upside play between him and Montgomery. Maybe sometimes his floor isn't as safe, but I would argue the opposite, man. Like, Gibbs has been consistently fantastic. He's the running back 3 because he's been exceptional the entire year. Not a single game outside of double-digit fantasy points in a half PPR format. So he has been absolutely outstanding, and I expect it to continue. And then with Joe Mixon here, again, it also does have to do with schedule right here. Joe Mixon being at 6, it's important to note, is because he has a week 14 bye. So he gets Jacksonville, which is an exceptional matchup. Now, this Tennessee game that they just played, that was like an anomaly. Honestly, like that was the worst game he had in fantasy football if you take out the week 2 game versus Chicago where he left the game early because of that high ankle sprain. That week 12 game versus Tennessee, that's a blemish on his record because he averaged only 1.6 yards per carry. But again, I'm not too worried about this. This was an outlier performance right here from a guy who has been exceptional all year. And then obviously having to rank him down here at number 6 is only because he has a bye week coming up. And then Bijan Robinson at 7 to round this tier out. With Bijan Robinson, he's obviously been fantastic as well. Now, his last game he did play against Denver, that was a down week. And again, that's why he's lower as well. Because Denver was a tough run defense. So they're coming off a bye this week. Then they get the Chargers and then Minnesota in Minnesota. Those are his next 2 games, his final 2 games of the regular season of fantasy football. Those are not good matchups. Like, there's no arguing that. So, is he a little bit matchup dependent? Maybe some would argue yes. And I do think that there is the element that you can't ignore, which is Tyler Algier is going to get a consistent weekly workload. So, with Bijan Robinson here, I don't see him hitting his ceiling, and that's why he's clearly, to me, at the bottom of tier 2, and I cannot rank him higher than at number 7 this week. Dropping down to our next tier, I've got Alvin Kamara at 8 and James Cook at 9. So really with Alvin Kamara, like if you actually look at his game log, he has definitely gone downhill in fantasy over the past like month and a half. Like the first month of September, he was fantastic in fantasy. He obviously had the massive explosion game in week 2, and ever since then, like 20-point games have been mixed in there, but there's also been some 12-point games, a couple single-digit games. So a lot of it does depend on how much he gets in the end zone and how efficient he is on the ground. Well, here's the problem with Alvin Kamara. He hasn't had a single rushing touchdown since week 7 versus Denver. He has not gotten in the end zone since then, either through the receiving game as well. What keeps him here ultimately is we know he has the receiving upside. And with a player like this who's close to 30, he definitely needs a little bit of rest. So with Alvin Kamara coming off the bye week, I do have more confidence in him moving forward, but still not tons as I did in September. And then James Cook. James Cook, the only problem with him, it's kind of similar to Breece Hall here at 10, is that both of these guys, their workload fluctuates on a weekly basis here. Matchup, I don't think particularly matters with either of these guys. They're both fantastic, and when used correctly, are the best offensive weapon in their entire offense. With James Cook, there's games where he has 20 carries, and then there's games where he has like 5 or 10 carries. It's bizarre. And then Breece Hall, it's the same thing. Like his upside in fantasy, like everybody's, is completely tied to volume. The problem with these two guys is that they don't have consistent volume. So with Breece Hall, obviously I love him, and I love James Cook as well, and they both have massive 30-point ceilings, but at the same time, their floor is actually pretty low. Dropping down to our next tier, Chase Brown at 11 and David Montgomery at 12. So obviously with Chase Brown, he has been fantastic ever since he became the lead dog. And really, if you kind of look at Chase Brown, it gives me Austin Eckler type of vibes, because Chase Brown has not been exactly fantastic running the ball. He hasn't been bad, but every single week it's kind of a little bit of a different bag. Like there's some weeks where he averages 3 yards per carry, then there's other weeks where he averages 4, sometimes 5. Like a lot of it's kind of a mixed bag. It is totally matchup dependent how he performs on the ground. But again, his targets per game since week 8 have been awesome. 4 targets, 5 targets, 11 targets, 7 targets. This guy has been everywhere for this offense. So obviously he's playing 80% of the snaps, and the upside in fantasy is directly correlated with this target share that he's getting. I don't see it going away. That's why I like Chase Brown coming off a bye week in these last 2 weeks. And then with Montgomery, I don't even feel like I need to talk about it, really. Like I said, this Detroit running system, matchup doesn't matter. It ultimately just comes down to we can count on David Montgomery getting in the end zone weekly. The only thing to note here is that he did leave the game early on Sunday versus the Indianapolis Colts with a shoulder injury. But essentially what happened is that he could have came back, but Dan Campbell said to him, we have bigger fish to fry. So we've got a Thursday night game against the Bears, a good matchup versus running backs. I think Dave Montgomery is so secure here in the top 12. And then with Kenneth Walker and Kyren Williams to round this tier out at 13 and 14, I think that both of these guys, it's just kind of a readjustment of expectations a little bit. With Kenneth Walker, the interesting thing is, like, for the majority of the year, he's actually gotten it done in weird ways. Like, his again, it's similar to Chase Brown. Sometimes his yards per carry fluctuate massively. Like, there's weeks where he can get 5 yards per carry, and then there's weeks like he did against the Arizona Cardinals where he averages 2.6 yards per carry. But essentially what happens is whenever that happens, he gets a lot of targets per game. It's so similar to Chase Brown, except with him, he gets Arizona again, and that wasn't a good matchup the first time. I don't know if it changes, but he does get the Jets here in week 13, so I do think that Kenneth Walker will kind of just continue to find ways to be fantasy good. It just depends ultimately on what his efficiency will be, and I do think in particular week 13 he will be efficient. And then with Kyren Williams here, he gets back in the end zone against the Philadelphia Eagles, but other than that, like, he was, he fumbled twice and he was efficient, but it is definitely an issue, I think, with Kyren Williams, because again, his volume is very consistent. He doesn't get much through the air anymore, though. Like, ever since Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua came back, his volume through the air has definitely gone down. So unless he gets in the end zone every week, it is a problem. Now, he does have 2 good matchups, New Orleans and Buffalo, who is actually pretty susceptible to running backs in fantasy. So he does have opportunistic matchups that I want to take advantage of. I also want to take advantage of Patrick Mahomes' projection on Underdog this week, because on Black Friday, he has a 0.5 total projected in this week on Underdog. So you hit the higher on this one as a new customer, you're basically winning free money. And if you want to take advantage of it this week, go down in the comments and grab the link that's there and use code FFN to sign up for Underdog. When you hit the higher on this sweat-free pick for Patrick Mahomes this week, they'll match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash. Now, going down to our brain melting tier. This is going to melt brains, and I can't wait to see how many people are upset with my ranking Chuba Hubbard over Christian McCaffrey. I have said it all freaking year. I don't care about Jonathan Brooks, because Chuba Hubbard, it didn't matter against the Chiefs. It didn't matter. What mattered against the Chiefs when it was a tough matchup. But even in a tough matchup, he managed to get in the freaking end zone, because this guy has absolutely been a revelation for a team that has consistently said, we want to be a run-first team. He's their guy. They just signed him to a 4-year, $30+ million deal where about half of the contract was guaranteed. They're not moving off of him. Jonathan Brooks may get 5 carries a game. Who cares? He wasn't even good on his opportunities. I don't worry about it. Whereas Christian McCaffrey, I do worry about him. With McCaffrey, his upside is definitely just not there at the same level that we've known and seen it as. His efficiency has not been there. His targets per game are what keeps him in order to be a fantasy relevant player, because it's similar to Kamara, but he's not even getting in the end zone and having big explosion games yet. Now again, we're still only a couple games deep into McCaffrey's season, but the way the 49ers are playing right now, it's been a season from hell for them. I mean, it's a bad season for the 49ers, so I just don't see this one going back to what we expected as the number 1 overall pick. It's unfortunate, but we just cannot rank Christian McCaffrey based on a lie. And then with J.K. Dobbins here at 17, I think that J.K. Dobbins is a little bit sketchy to rank. Like, with J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards has been more involved since he got back. He's also got some tough matchups. He's got Baltimore tonight, which is not easy. Atlanta, which is ironically tough against running backs, kind of because you could throw all over them, but these are minor details. And then the Kansas City Chiefs in week 14. He's got really tough matchups ahead. So if he splits work with Gus Edwards and those are his matchups, I don't really particularly love JK. Now, the thing is that if he does end up handling the majority of the work moving forward, I do think that J.K. Dobbins does have a good enough offensive line and a run system as a whole to be inside of the top 20. Now, dropping down to our next tier, Jonathan Taylor and Aaron Jones at 19. Jonathan Taylor's an issue, man. I was discussing this before week 12 fantasy football, and what I was essentially saying in that week was that, listen, Jonathan Taylor, the fear before the season was with Anthony Richardson, he's going to take away the rushing upside at the end zone because he's not going to get, his goal line opportunities. They're going to be taken from it by Anthony Richardson. Well, it's happened the past several weeks. And even in these, the game versus the Jets, he averaged 2.4 yards per carry. Well, then against the tougher defense, Detroit, he averages 3.2 yards per carry. So if he's not going to be efficient, it's not going to work. Now, he does have a week 14 bye, which automatically ranks him lower, but New England is the saving matchup. He should be a saving grace. He gets New England this upcoming week. So if he doesn't perform in this one, I don't know what to say anymore. I don't know if he can be inside the top 20. Honestly, because he doesn't get targets, he doesn't get goal line work, so he has to be extremely efficient and hit big plays. And the last several weeks, he has done the exact opposite of that. And then at number 19 with Aaron Jones, I think that Aaron Jones had a great week, a great bounce back week against Chicago, and I was all here for it. Like, he had 22 carries for over 100 yards. Over the next 2 weeks against Arizona and Atlanta, though, those are not good matchups. And if we just look back to a couple weeks ago against Tennessee, he had 2.6 yards per carry. So this guy, even though he looked better against the Bears, they've actually been particularly susceptible to the run. I don't see that the other two matchups upcoming are as susceptible as the Bears were. Isaiah Pacheco at 20 and Tony Pollard at 21. With Isaiah Pacheco here, we obviously need to see this guy back in the lineup. Now, by all accounts, it does look like he will be coming back in week 13 in this Black Friday game. And with Isaiah Pacheco, whenever he does come back, I want in on him immediately. Now, it is important to note here that I don't think he's going to take 100% of the work, at least in that first game back versus the Raiders. I do think he'll get closer to 100% against the Chargers in week 14, but it's not a good matchup. So he essentially has one good matchup to take advantage of versus the Raiders, where I don't think he'll handle all the work. And then he has the next matchup where I do think he'll handle the majority, but it is against the Chargers, and they're not a good defense to take on for a running back. So Isaiah Pacheco, I do still think there's going to be limitations, but I particularly think he's probably a better option for the playoffs. And then with Tony Pollard at 21, it comes down to, is Tyjae Spears going to be relevant? If Tyjae Spears is relevant in this offense, his upside is not as high. We just saw proof of it the last 2 weeks against the Texans. In a brutal matchup, he had a great game. He had a fantastic game because they used him. And then that other week before, when they played the Minnesota Vikings, he only had 9 carries. Like, it is completely dependent on what they plan on doing with Tyjae Spears. He's got Washington, he's got Jacksonville. These matchups are fantastic, but ultimately, do they use Tyjae Spears or do they not? I like Tony Pollard based on matchup here, but not as much more than a low-end RB2. And then James Conner at 22. He's fallen for sure. James Conner, there is a real issue here. With James Conner, Trey Benson is becoming more of a factor on every single week. He actually just beat out James Conner in rushing yards against the Seahawks. And that was on 4 carries. He had 7 carries for 8 yards. Like, only thing that's saving him right now is targets. 5 targets, 5 catches, 41 yards against the Seahawks. Now he gets Minnesota and then Seattle again. 2 really bad matchups, and I do think that what we're going to start to see is more Trey Benson involvement. So at this point, we've got to adjust our ranking for James Conner. He cannot be viewed as anything more than a low-end RB2, and Trey Benson is on the rise. Dropping down to our next tier, Tyrone Tracy and Bucky Irving, our 2 rookie running backs here. One of them's got a massive issue, and that's Tyrone Tracy Jr. because he plays for the Giants. That team quit on the Giants versus the Buccaneers. Like, they just quit. But the irony is Tyrone Tracy Jr. is one of the bright spots along with Malik Neighbors. Like, he actually looked pretty good. He was efficient. He's been efficient all year. So with Tyrone Tracy Jr., as long as he continues to get carries and targets out of the backfield, he will have fantasy involvement. Now, in those blowout games, his ceiling is low. What we just saw with Tampa Bay, that ceiling is not good enough. But in more competitive games, which it probably will be against the Cowboys and against the New Orleans Saints, those are fantastic matches to take advantage of for a running back. And I do think they're more efficient. So ultimately, like, he's down here because I can't believe and trust in the Giants, but I do still like his upside. And then with Bucky Irving at 24, Bucky Irving is the better running back in Tampa Bay. Are we all ready to admit it? Like, it's not close. They continue to split carries, and he continues to be better on a per-touch basis objectively than Rachaad White. And he even outdid him in the receiving work, which has kind of been Rachaad White's bread and butter in week 12. So with Bucky Irving, I think, personally, what we're going to see is more Bucky Irving moving forward. I think that is essentially going to become their new guy. And I've got him ranked accordingly as an RB2 because I believe it is coming, and I believe that he has upside to even be inside the top 20. DeAndre Swift at 25 and Ramondre Stevenson at 26. With DeAndre Swift, There's been an issue here the past 2 weeks, actually without Shane Waldron. The guy who benefited the most from Shane Waldron there was DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift, without Shane Waldron the past 2 weeks, he's averaged 5.1 yards per carry and 2.3. Now, the 5.1 yards per carry against the Green Bay Packers, he split work essentially with Roschon Johnson. Well, this past week versus Minnesota, he handled the majority, but he had 13 carries versus the Minnesota Vikings. So with these next two matchups, he gets Detroit brutal and then San Francisco beatable. So with these matchups here, I like one of them, don't like the other, and then essentially what it comes down to is he going to handle, more than 15 opportunities per game? Because that's what he needs, because he's been less efficient and Roschon Johnson does have involvement. And then when we got somebody like Ramondre here, obviously I'm taking a lot of flack for Ramondre in my ranking of him this year. Listen, I'm fine with Ramondre as a player. He's on a bad offense. Just admit it. The truth will set you free. It will set you free. Ramondre's a good fantasy running back, but at the same time, he has games like the Miami Dolphins game where he has 3.3 fantasy points in a half PPR format, and that's because his team sucks. His team sucks, bro. So against Indy, and then he has a bye week in week 14, you can't rank him any higher than this. Let the truth set you free with Ramondre Stevenson. It's just something we need to do to cathartically exercise ourselves. Dropping down to our last tier right here. Nick Chubb, Najee Harris at 27 and 28. Nick Chubb is definitely getting better. He's improving. He got in the end zone twice against the Steelers. They get the Steelers again in week 14, which I do think is a good matchup for him again. But Nick Chubb, it is also worth noting, was not as efficient against the Pittsburgh Steelers. He got those 2 carries at the red zone. At the goal line is what he's kind of been doing. Now, the encouraging part is that he handled 20 opportunities versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the volume looks like it's going up, but maybe the efficiency isn't. I just don't think he's still the same player right now. With Najee Harris, he still has a Jaylen Warren problem. And that's why Jaylen Warren is at 29. Because Jaylen Warren finally outproduced Najee in week 12 against the Cleveland Browns, because Najee is not the more efficient guy. That's always been Jaylen Warren. What it comes down to is how many opportunities Warren gets. Warren's finally healthy, and he's getting opportunities that are equivalent to Najee Harris. That's a problem for Najee, and I do think that both of them are still inside top 30 because the running game in Pittsburgh is actually pretty good. Now, these next 2 matchups, they've got Cincinnati, then they've got the Cleveland Browns again. 2 division matchups, unpredictable, but ultimately I still do think both of them are good enough to be inside the top 30. And then Brian Robinson at 30 to round it out. He's got an ankle injury. He may not even play the next 2 weeks. He left that game early. He got robbed of a great fantasy day. A great fantasy day was loading, and an ankle injury robbed it. Now, this problem here, I just don't think is going away. Because if he plays, he's not going to play 50% of the snaps. Because that's not been what he's doing for the majority of the year because he's been dealing with injury. So either way we go, if he doesn't play, he's outside the top 30. And if he does play, his upside is not particularly high over the next 2 weeks. So let me know what your record is right now. And if you want to see the top 30 wide receiver rankings for the playoffs, click on this video right here.